Should you be 21 years old before you can buy a semi-automatic rifle? And if your gun falls into the wrong hands, should you be held legally liable?
If someone breaks into my house and steals my firearm, I shouldn't be the felon.
One of the core problems with gun violence, and we've seen it time and time again, is easy access to firearms.
Supporters of I-1639 say stricter gun laws are needed to protect our schools and communities. But opponents are firing back, calling it an attack on their self-defense and Second Amendment rights.
The intention is to reduce gun violence.
Both sides weigh in.
This is about penalizing firearm owners.
Taking aim at Washington's gun laws. Next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. Supporters of State Initiative 1639 are hoping to make history this fall. From raising the legal age to buy a semi-automatic rifle to 21, to enhancing background checks, establishing safe gun storage rules, and more, 1639 would enact some of the strictest firearm laws in the country if voters approve it. But opponents say the measure won't have any impact on gun violence, and instead will only punish law-abiding gun owners and restrict their ability to use firearms in self-defense. Now voters will decide if this plan to tighten our state's gun laws is aimed in the right direction or way off target. In July of 2016, 19-year-old Alan Ivanoff opened fire on a house party in Mukilteo with a semi-automatic rifle. He killed 3 former classmates from Kamiak High School, seriously wounded one other, and, as it turned out, pushed student Niko Battle into action.
I feel obligated to my peers and to my community because of the amount of gun violence that we experience.
The Ivanoff shooting was during Niko's sophomore year, but there was the school lockdown the year before when someone lit fireworks in a hallway. And just a few weeks ago, there was the shooting outside the Kamiak Mariner football game at Goddard Stadium that had fans running in panic.
And luckily no one was hit, but it's that culture, and seeing gun violence happen that often has really created almost a legacy of fear.
That's why Battle, a political veteran at age 17 who's worked on other gun measures in the past, is supporting Initiative 1639 this fall.
One of the main contributors of gun violence is easy access to firearms.
I-1639, if passed, would raise the age to buy a semi-automatic rifle from 18 to 21. Similar to our state's handgun law. Those who want a semi-automatic rifle would have to pass an enhanced background check, take a training course, and wait for 10 days after a purchase to get the gun. 1639 would also require gun owners to keep their firearms secured in their homes, or face criminal charges in some cases if someone prohibited from having such a weapon gets access to it.
So I think that it really is just an issue of common sense.
The Yes on 1639 campaign has close to $4.5 million in contributions as of early October, the majority coming from Northwest billionaires Paul Allen, Nick Hanauer, and Steve Ballmer and their families. With support from gun safety advocates, unions, and several high-profile state Democrats, Battle is hoping I-1639 will make history, making Washington's gun laws the toughest in the nation.
I think that Initiative 1639 has reasonable measures that will not harm law-abiding gun owners, but rather keep guns out of the hands of people who just shouldn't have them.
Good morning, ladies. I'd like to welcome you to the new shooter seminar.
Firearms safety instructor Jane Milhans sees 1639 much differently, and she speaks from personal experience too, as she recalls when 2 men broke into her home more than 10 years ago.
It was a tragic situation. I live with the nightmare every day.
I am also concerned just for my security and safety.
Milhans says the incident inspired her to be a firearms instructor. She teaches this gun safety class for women at the Tacoma Rifle and Revolver Club.
Did I get it?
Milhans says 1639's safe storage rules would harm gun owners who need quick access to their firearms for self-defense.
When someone breaks into your house, you have seconds to respond, and that second could kill you.
She says 1639's requirement to criminally charge gun owners when guns are unlawfully taken from their homes misses the mark too.
If someone breaks into my house and steals my firearm, I shouldn't be the felon.
And while 1639 touts itself as a school safety measure, Milhans points out more people die from handguns as opposed to semi-automatic rifles in our state. And suicides claim far more lives than school shootings.
And the reason kids are committing suicide is because they're bullied. And nothing in this initiative is addressing that, or safety in the schools.
The arguments against 1639 are similar to what you've heard in the past. And among the 4 No on 1639 campaigns in operation this year, the bulk of the $247,000 raised comes from a familiar gun bill foe, the NRA. But the battle lines may be changing, following 2 successful state gun measures in 2014 and 2016, and 2 local cities in King County passing new gun storage rules this year. Plus, there's a new galvanized student population too, who wants to take action against gun violence.
It has been the defining factor of our school experience, which is why we're stepping up and why we're pushing for change like Initiative 1639.
But many people are firing back against the broad, sweeping reforms presented by I-1639, which Jane Milhans says places a stigma on gun owners who follow the law.
We do not want to be labeled as killers. We are not the problem.
And joining us to discuss this very important issue, we have with us Paul Kramer. He's on the yes side. He is the citizen sponsor of 1639. Paul, good to have you.
Thank you, Brian. Glad to be here.
All right. We also have Glen Morgan. He is one of 3 parties who challenged 1639 for making the ballot. He's on the no side. Glen, good to have you too.
Yeah, Brian, thanks for having us here.
All right, here we go. Had a coin flip before the start of the show, and Paul, I'd like to have you tell us about your personal connection to this issue and why you're a citizen sponsor for 1639.
Thanks again for having us here. I invite your viewers to vote yes on Initiative 1639 as a reasonable measure to reduce gun violence here in Washington State. I'm supporting this initiative because my son, Will, then 18 years old, was shot in the back by an AR-15 style semi-automatic assault rifle at an innocent gathering of friends in a private loving home in Mukilteo in 2016. He was nearly killed. Will was lucky enough to survive, but 3 of his friends were not. I've witnessed and shared their parents' extreme grief over the loss of their children. No family should have to suffer the pain and tragedy of losing a child to a senseless act of gun violence. Initiative 1639 will help make sure that that doesn't happen again here in Washington State.
Thank you very much for that. Glenn, your opening statement on why you oppose this measure.
I generally oppose 1639 because as legislation, I think it's poorly written and doesn't actually address many of the root crimes of situation from where we see crimes being committed by people with firearms. I don't think that the way that it's drafted is going to actually address that. I think it's primarily addressing attacking legal firearm owners, and I think it's no surprise the 4 people who primarily sponsored it are people who have 24-hour armed security guards who they aren't affected by this legislation in any way at all. And I think that all it's going to do is just criminalize people who are actually who own firearms, and unfortunately probably create more victims than it actually would ever try to help, because more people will actually be less likely to be able to defend themselves in situations in which they would actually be trying to protect themselves.
Okay, let's pull apart some of these issues here. And Glenn, I'll start with you. We require people to be 21 in our state to buy handguns, and supporters of 1639 would say, why not have that same restriction on semi-automatic rifles? They're adding in a 10-day waiting period and some safety training too. But the Yes campaign is really saying if that age restriction had been in place, shootings like the one that involved the Kramer family might not have happened.
We see shootings all the time with people who aren't supposed to have firearms. They are able to acquire them, unfortunately, one way or another illegally. We see that even in countries in which firearms are entirely banned. So I don't think that that's a legitimate argument about this case. But one of the issues that we do have is that the question is, where do you become an adult? You know, the initiative itself says that children's brains aren't developed enough on page 2 to own firearms, and yet we believe that they're developed enough that they can be in the military, they can sign contracts, get married, run for office and vote, and those are all things that they can cause great harm in those cases too. So the question is where that adulthood begins, and we don't think denying their Second Amendment rights or their freedoms at that age is an appropriate approach.
Paul, your thoughts about this, raising the age to 21 there, why?
It only makes sense. They're highly lethal weapons, and to suggest that the initiative is restricting access to all firearms for young men and women of that age, 18 to 20-year-olds, is a misrepresentation, because that age group would still have access to rifles and shotguns of bolt, lever, pump, action type firearms with full capability to defend themselves. Let me add one little piece, please. The opening section, Jane, the firearm instructor, suggested that the No campaign, that this initiative criminalizes self-defense, and that is a misrepresentation. This initiative in no way criminalizes self-defense. We don't want to take that away from anyone.
Written in the measure there, and that's an important piece of this. But
It is.
I do want to make sure that I dive into this secure storage issue. And Paul, let me stay with you on this one. So 1639, if it passes, would require gun owners to lock up their weapons when they're at home. So I'm going to focus on the self-defense part of this first here. Many gun owners would say a safe or a trigger lock would make it more difficult to access their gun when they might need it at home, and in a home invasion, seconds really count. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, the initiative doesn't actually require the safe storage. When a person is home and attending their firearm,
They can carry it on them, you're saying, yeah.
in their
okay.
home, absolutely. They can
Okay.
have it on them, with them.
Okay.
What the initiative does, it is incentivizes safe storage, such that if there were an irresponsible adult that left their firearm unsecured and it were taken by a child or a prohibited person and then used to harm themselves or harm someone else, then the owner of the firearm could be held legally responsible for that. And the prosecuting attorney in every county in the state has discretion, full discretion, in how to move forward, in whether to prosecute or not, and how to prosecute.
Glenn, let me make sure I bring you in here, because safe storage has become a hot issue here in King County.
It is.
Even over the last couple of weeks here.
Right.
Seattle and Edmonds have passed safe gun storage measures. King County just did the same thing about a week or so ago. What does it say to you that 3 larger local jurisdictions have built up support for this idea?
Well, I mean, at least the politicians have decided that that's what they're going to do. So one of the things about this is that, and what's unique, and even the Attorney General mentioned, this is a radical departure from current law and how they approach things, and that people who have not committed any crime are going to become felons. And by basically applying that, rather than just using the negligence statutes that already exist, this is kind of giving away a little bit of the game, and that the point is actually to harass legal firearm owners. If somebody instead turns him into a felon because somebody broke into your house and stole a firearm and then used it in a crime later on, you really are changing the game here entirely. And it's about victim shaming. It's about going after people who've already been victimized by crime and turning them into criminals. And I think that that's really a big problem with how the initiative was drafted. And it did come up even in the ballot title challenge. Again, the AG brought up that was a pretty significant departure from existing law. Beyond that, there's all kinds of other issues here that I think are pretty significant and worth pointing out. The gun tax, for example, or long ago, literacy tests and poll taxes went out of favor when it came to voting rights, and yet we're bringing them back in under a Second Amendment application here, where we're basically denying people the access to firearms and making them more expensive.
Can we hold on that
Sure.
gun tax piece for a little bit, because I want to make sure we dive fully into this safe storage issue here. And Glenn, let me stick with you here, because the language of 1639 does have some provisions that protect gun owners if they're taken. If you report a stolen gun within 5 days of this theft, you wouldn't be criminally liable. And the Yes campaign, I think, is really pointing to the studies that show unsecured guns are trouble. 85% of school shooters got their firearm from the home of a friend or relative. 75% of youth suicide attempts trace back to guns stored in their own home or a relative or a friend. 1639 is trying to attach some consequences to that, I think, is what the Yes side's saying.
Right, but if that was the point, then they would focus on that, on just trying to address actual criminal liability, which we already have related to somebody being negligent in what they do. I mean, those laws already exist. But this is about penalizing firearm owners. And if it wasn't, it wouldn't have all this other grab bag worth of stuff that's gotten thrown into it. It's become a kind of a Christmas tree of all these different ideas all thrown into one concept.
Okay, Paul, your thoughts about this part of it, safe storage?
Yeah, to suggest that this initiative's intention is to penalize gun owners is a misrepresentation and a distortion. The intention is to reduce gun violence. Gun owners are only held accountable if their firearm is stolen and it goes unreported.
Right.
If their firearm is stolen and it's reported, they're relieved of liability. All they have to do is report it. It's very simple and straightforward. This is a comprehensive package, but each piece is a reasonable, moderate, common sense step towards reducing gun violence.
Okay, all right, we'll leave. Did you have a point there, Glenn?
Yeah, and I don't think that the intention, if the intention was actually to reduce violent crime, we would be focusing on criminals and not focusing on people who are not criminals. And that's the thing, is we're trying to turn people into criminals.
Where are they getting the guns, though, I think is the question.
And the question is, are we doing anything to address one of the biggest causes, I think, and clearly the studies show this, that mental health is a big problem. And in our state, basically doesn't have a functioning mental health system. And if the billionaires who are doing this were actually putting that money into trying to address some of the many problems that we have in pre-screening in schools for depression, all kinds of other applications on the mental health side, the overprescription of drugs that actually have mood changers and actually change how people operate, then we'd be addressing those issues. That would be a real bill that would actually be addressing crime. And instead what we're doing is we're trying to take an object and saying that that's the reality. Just because I have a firearm that's a semi-automatic, it doesn't mean that I'm going to become a mass shooter today. And yet there's an attempt to apply a lot of different, all kinds of different things in there. Again, I think that the tax can't be ignored.
No, let's bring that up. That's a very important part of this. And Paul, I'll go to you. Quickly, please.
A quick piece. I think that Glenn and some others on the pro-gun side might be taking this personally, and it's not personal. There's nothing against gun owners on this. I would hope that we could all agree on the importance of safe storage, on the importance of training in advance of purchase, on the importance of enhanced background checks to weed out people who shouldn't own firearms. These are reasonable measures that I would hope that we could all agree on. That you bring in the importance of addressing mental health is also a critical issue and absolutely needs to be addressed here in our state separately and hopefully simultaneously with this initiative.
Okay, which is another piece of that argument here. But maybe I can direct your attention, Paul, if I could, to this idea of the increased background check. Glenn brought this up earlier for pistols and rifles. This check is so extensive that 1639 allows for this $25 licensing fee to offset administrative costs. So the no side would say, in doing this, 1639 creates this de facto registry of gun owners, and they're pushing back. We already have a national background check for firearms. Why was this new increased layer of checks at the state level put into this measure?
What Initiative 1639 seeks to do is equalize the background check for semi-automatic rifles that's already in place for pistols, for handguns. That's a federal check and also a local background check to make sure that mental health records are also checked to weed out people with disturbing mental health history, or if they have a domestic violence protection order in their record, they would not be able to purchase these highly lethal semi-automatic rifles like they're currently prohibited from purchasing a pistol, a handgun.
Okay. Please, thank you for that. Glenn, your thoughts here.
Well, the thing is that the initiative is, I think, misleading and deceptive in the way that it describes what an enhanced background check is. It's currently the same NICS system that you're going to be going through. Now, the initiative actually doesn't require anything special on the state level, just in theory creates this potential bureaucracy that can eventually grow and create some kind of a new system that you have to have a de facto registry of everybody who owns a firearm, because you have to go back and keep running them through the same system again.
I think the hope is to track those guns and where they are.
Partially that too, but I mean that again is a registry. If that's all you're doing is you're tracking who owns which guns, then unfortunately that doesn't tend to lead to good things down the road. And the problem is then again it's also distracting from the people who are problems. We have a small percentage of the population, criminals or mental health or somebody who's had something that's already distinguished themselves in the record, or they should have, and we're basically choosing to ignore that and basically attach a one-size-fits-all kind of punishment on the other people who actually own firearms responsibly.
Okay, thank you for that back and forth. Paul, I want to switch gears a little bit here. Talk about who supports 1639. The no side would say, with 3 Northwest billionaires providing most of the financial contributions here, the measure doesn't truly represent our state. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, that's also a misrepresentation. We have thousands of Washingtonians supporting this initiative financially, through their volunteer time and effort. Yes, we have the support of some wealthy individuals, and I, for one, am very grateful for that. And we have a broad mix of support. And we'll see in a few weeks on Election Day what the will of the people is, what the true will of the people of the state of Washington is.
Yeah, there's been a few different votes over the past few years that might give an indication there. We're going to touch on that in a second. But Glenn, let me flip the question to you here.
Sure.
I know most of the funding for the No campaign comes from NRA headquarters in Virginia. What message do you think that sends to voters?
Well, and I mean, I think that's fairly predictable, right? The NRA probably has one of the largest membership organizations in America of any organization, and so that's logical that they're going to probably put money into this, as they always have. But really, when you look at, I'm not an NRA member, but I mean, there's a lot of people that are gun owners that aren't members and that are out there in opposition, in addition to probably the people who are members. And it's a fraction of the money that's been put into by the billionaires. And it's not just the three, it's also Michael Bloomberg out of New York who's funded this substantially. And again, if these billionaires were remotely serious about actually addressing crime, they would be doing things that address criminals instead of trying to turn more people into criminals and creating a system that's unworkable. And it's sad to see that, but that's really what we'd prefer to see, is actually trying to address the crime itself and prevent making more punishment, more penalties for people who actually use guns in crimes, things like that. So.
Were you surprised? I'm just thinking of the trends of the past few years, 2014, 2016. Clearly, people in our state are looking to have stricter gun laws here. What does that say to you about 2018?
I think if you look at those two initiatives in 14 and 16, they were far less controversial, and there was also confusion. I remember the 2014, which is the 594 initiative. There was confusion because there was a 591 initiative on the ballot at the same time, and I think that actually led to a lot of confusion.
Measure.
You're right, that people didn't know which one was which, actually. That was a lot of problem, I think, that was created by that. But I don't think you saw the same level of concern with the 2016 initiative. The 2018 is very different. I mean, this is a grab bag of everything. This is every idea that's ever been proven to not work when it comes to dealing with crime, and thrown all into one to punish people who own firearms. And there's no doubt that that's what it does, and that's unfortunate.
Paul, let me get you in on this. I know Glenn was involved in this court battle even to get 1639 on the ballot here. Looking ahead, are you concerned that if this measure passes, it could face some lawsuits for dealing with more than one topic? There's a number of different ways that the NRA or other groups might go after this. What do you think going in the future?
What does this initiative deal with? It concerns firearms. Do I expect lawsuits after the election in November? Yes. And we'll see what the courts decide. But by that point, we'll see what the will of the people are. We'll see what the people of the state of Washington want on this.
It is a very broad issue, though. It tackles a lot of different things. Raising that minimum age there for the semi-automatic. Let's talk about that. It's not a I shouldn't say focus, but it's not one of those issues that looks at one piece of the firearms issue, but really a lot of different ones. Why is it so broad? Maybe that's the question.
It's broad to bring in prevention measures every step of the way to make sure that gun owners are responsible with their firearms, and to prevent those intent on causing harm from accessing a firearm.
Okay. All right. Glenn, I want to make sure I follow up on this court side here, because you know, and I know, the court's ruled that 1639 could make the ballot there. But if it passes, do you think the No campaign, some of these groups would challenge this in court? And if so, why? I'm just drawing on your legal background.
I think there's a lot of reasons to challenge it. I mean, the original problem with the initiative and why it went to court in the first place, and why the Thurston County Judge Dixon threw it out of court, was because the initiative that we're talking about here is actually the language that's with the Secretary of State's office, not the language that was on the back of the on the initiative, because it was the wrong language and it was screwed up. And so, the Supreme Court decided that they're no longer going to arbitrate the Constitution, even though that's supposedly where you're supposed to go for it. So that decision was very bizarre and unfortunate when it comes to the initiative process, and then that allows this to get on the ballot, even though it was so screwed up in the beginning and incompetently run, I think, by the consultants more than anything else. You have something that's been poorly drafted and really, I don't think, thought out very well. They put together a lot of stuff that wasn't really detailed, and it's unfortunately extremely vague as well. It provides a lot of opportunity for abuse with the Department of Licensing, and you're assuming that suddenly the Department of Licensing is going to be able to do all these miracles in the way that it's drafted. And I think that there's going to be lots of challenges, and it's unfortunate. Good legislation shouldn't be drafted in a way that encourages that.
I'll let you have a brief rebuttal of that and then a closing statement, Paul.
I think the statement is reflective of a very high level of distrust in our government. And it's just mistaken to have that as an operating principle. If we're so distrustful of our government, it leaves us in a very, I don't know, difficult place. This initiative trusts the Department of Licensing to safely hold records and allow for annual checks to make sure that firearm owners are still in a legal position to continue to own that firearm. Okay. It's not about creating a registry. It's about having the database to be able to check and make sure that they're still legal to own their firearms.
Paul, I need you to wrap up the show if you could. 45 seconds for a closing statement, please.
If Initiative 1639 had been in place in 2016, the 19-year-old shooter who seriously injured my son and killed 3 of his friends, he would not have been able to purchase that AR-15 style semi-automatic rifle that allowed him to conduct that shooting. Initiative 1639 puts in place reasonable, common sense, moderate measures to help reduce gun violence in Washington State and to save lives.
Okay, thank you very much. Glenn, I can give you 45 seconds too.
Well, the gun control is ultimately about people control. That's what it is. The way that it's drafted is to control people. And unfortunately, this bill as drafted doesn't do anything to actually address crime, but it does do a lot to create a massive bureaucracy and confusion and litigation related to gun owners. Unfortunately, it won't address any of the issues that the sponsors claim that it did. I would hope that Initiative 1639 does not pass so that when the next crazy person decides to come in and do something at a house, that there's a responsible adult or somebody else, somebody who could be 18 years old, the ability to access a firearm and immediately respond and stop that threat immediately when there's somebody terrible around like that.
Okay, thank you both very much for your input here, and we will be right back.
The Constitution says we're supposed to have guns. And when you start making laws saying we can't have guns, then, where are we at?
I don't think an 18-year-old should be able to get a semi-automatic weapon.
If somebody breaks into my house, I don't want to be fumbling around with a combination to try and get my gun out of a safe, that's for sure.
I'm in favor of protections that keep people from misusing firearms.
We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook and Twitter and give us your feedback. Before we close today, it's time for our weekly CIO poll. Do you plan to support stricter gun laws in our state? Yes, no, or are you undecided? We want to know what you think. Cast your vote and send us your comments at our website, seattlechannel.org/cityinsideout. While you're there, you can watch our programs online anytime. Coming up next week, the Families Education, Preschool, and Promise Levy. Seattle city leaders are asking voters to replace 2 expiring levies with one that's twice as large to close the opportunity gap in our increasingly unaffordable city. Should taxpayers help fund preschool to college education for Seattle's youth? We hear from both sides next time on City Inside Out. I hope you join us.